Hey there. Well, yesterday was an insane day in Saudi Arabia. There are like three fairly serious news items related to that country. Today, I'd like to look into them briefly, focusing on one in particular. Basically, the Saudi Arabian Game of Thrones has gone completely nuts. I think we now know why it was that Saudi Crown Prince MBS was making all those moves towards moderation last week. I just talked about it last Tuesday. He was basically doing sort of preemptive cover for the moves that happened yesterday. This video is a bit of a long, disorganized ramble, but I think I've got some good points to make if you've got the time, so bear with me. Okay, so let's talk about what exactly happened. Probably the most important thing that happened yesterday is something I'm not going to talk about much. Prime Minister Hariri, the Sunni Prime Minister of Lebanon, went to Saudi Arabia and resigned, claiming that there were attempts on his life and that Iran and Hezbollah were somehow undermining him. I sadly do not know enough about Lebanon to talk about this appropriately, but Lebanon is going to be very important in the coming months as the United States tries to start a fight with Iran. This destabilization of Lebanon is a very, very problematic thing. It's a place where the sectarian balance is carefully maintained. It's even in the Constitution that there be, I believe it's a Sunni prime minister, and then the president might have to be Christian. And it's, as I said, I don't know enough about it, and I won't be able to get into it. The second thing that happened was that the Houthis in Yemen managed to get a missile closer to Riyadh than they normally do. I think it made it to the outskirts before it was shot down. Riyadh is a large city in Saudi Arabia. The Houthis are an insurgent group in Yemen that the Saudis are bombing very heavily. This was sort of exciting and interesting to look at, but honestly, probably not all that important. It was interesting to see Saudi spokesmen get up there and talk about the Houthis' flagrant disregard for human life and innocent civilians when they are bombing civilians in Yemen every day. I think it was yesterday or the day before that another single bombing killed 26 civilians in Yemen. Finally, and probably most important for the topics that this channel has covered so far, the Saudi Arabian Game of Thrones went crazy. A number of people have been arrested. The current count is that 11 princes, 4 serving ministers, and dozens of ex-ministers have all been arrested. This is sort of a government purge, not just a government purge, but a sort of a societal purge that could go further. This is a sweeping thing. This is a very big deal. This is a serious change to the system that has governed Saudi Arabia. It is a change to the system that has governed Saudi Arabia since the 1950s. Modern Saudi Arabia was founded by Ibn Saud, a guy who sort of came out of the desert, formed the state in the 1920s and 1930s, and managed to rule until the 1950s. Every Saudi king since then has been one of his sons. This is problematic because his sons have been getting older and older and older, to the point where King Salman, the guy who's ruling now, is largely rumored to be somewhat incapacitated, like he's only got a couple good hours a day. And he also had 45 separate sons. So I think 36 of which made it to adulthood. So you've got all these different centers of power. So each of these sons managed to form a different wing of the Saudi royal family. Some of these sons are associated with differing ideas about how the country should be run. And when one of these sons comes to power, they are then able to sort of hand out the goodies to everybody else in the system. So for pretty much the past, almost 70 years, since the 1950s, this was always a fraught system, but it was a system that was sort of maintained. The family looked after itself, it disagreed, individual folks would fall out of favor, individual kings would be deposed or assassinated, but generally it sort of went forward. What we're seeing now is a wholesale change to this. It is now the sort of lineage of the current king that is taking power and is taking away power from all of the other groupings, or at least some of the groupings, and things are being more consolidated under one person. This brings me to the first major point I'd like to make here. Saudi Arabia is not a normal country. It is an absolute monarchy. Once upon a time, almost all of the world was ruled by similar systems, kings or emperors, where what happened at the royal courts was more important than anything else. We've become accustomed to a different way of living in the 20th and 21st century. We talk about peoples and systems and parliaments, and not just in democracies, even in dictatorships. We have to deal with the military or coups or this, that, and the other thing. Saudi Arabia is fundamentally different, and I would argue fundamentally worse. This is a throwback to a different era. And I think that we've fallen into a bit of a trap with our interpretation of this stuff, sort of looking at this Saudi prince as some kind of dictator or strongman or someone who's consolidating power and things are going to move forward and that could be better or worse. We're dealing with a royal here. We're dealing with somebody who was born into power. And yes, he is consolidating power, the current king and the now next in line, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. They are consolidating power, but it's not in a way that we really recognize from other places, and I think that's a real danger that we sort of treat it like it's a real modern country. It's not. This really is sort of Game of Thrones stuff. Your model here is not what's going on in Syria or what's going on in the United States or what's going on in Turkey. Your model here is what went on in the 1400s in the United Kingdom or what goes on Game of Thrones, the HBO TV show. So the way I see it, there were two major things that were going on here, one of which has been focused on. This was a consolidation of power. Muteb bin Abdullah was the last son of the last Saudi king, King Abdullah, who came right before King Salman, the current guy. He was the last son of King Abdullah that had real power. He was in charge of the National Guard, one of the armed forces of Saudi Arabia. So this guy is now arrested and replaced. So that is definitely a consolidation of power. There were other elements of that with the people who have been arrested and taken out of power. Something that hasn't been reported on as much that I think might be just as important is that this was actually a consolidation of financial resources. The most famous person that has been swept up in this is a guy named Al-Waleed bin Talal. He's probably the Saudi prince with the highest public profile. He's quite famous in the States. He's had Twitter spats with Donald Trump, and he is a tremendously rich investor. I think the most recent estimate of his personal net worth is $18 billion. He owns chunks of Citigroup. He owns chunks of 21st Century Fox that may or may not still own a chunk of Fox News. Can't quite recall how all that corporate maneuvering had went. He owns a chunk of Twitter. Anyway, this guy is a big deal, and he is a rich guy. He was one of at least 3 billionaires that were swept up here. And it's interesting, you can't really just do the math like this, but if you actually tot up the net worths of all these guys, you get to like $25 billion. I mean, that alone is roughly half of what Saudi Arabia is likely to get from the Saudi Aramco IPO. Saudi Arabia is contemplating selling off like 5% of Aramco, the state oil company, and that's likely to bring $50 billion in. These arrests brought in, well, it's presumptuous to say that they brought in $25 billion, but I kind of suspect that might be one of the goals. This is an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about when I talk about Saudi Arabia not being a normal modern country. In the United States, if somebody got arrested, it didn't necessarily mean that all their money was forfeit, but this is an absolute monarchy, and this place works by very old rules. This is a very standard absolute monarch play. You are running out of money, so you arrest people or a class of people that have a lot of money, and you take that money. It's not for sure that this is what happened, but I suspect that might be a bigger part of this than most media sources are pointing towards. Another thing that has not been focused on enough is how odd it is that they arrested Al-Waleed bin Talal. This guy is, as I said, one of the most well-known Saudi Arabians. He is well-known outside of the country, has a public profile, is a big philanthropist. When you talk about a modern business-focused face of Saudi Arabia, this guy is kind of it. It's a bit nuts that we had the Saudi king talking about modernization and opening and business just last week, and now the biggest businessman has been arrested. I do not think this is good for the chances of an Aramco IPO in New York or London or anywhere. If you're trying to make the case that your country or your oil company are a great goal for investment, probably arresting one of your biggest investors is not the right way to do it. There are likely to be ramifications for the portfolio of companies that he owns, including Citigroup, Twitter, and a whole bunch of other stuff. This is a big deal, and it's a weird thing to do. And it also strikes me as interesting that it is this section of the royal family that has been attacked now. Al-Waleed bin Talal was a famous businessman, but his father, Talal, has sort of represented a more moderate, more Western-focused, more friendly to appropriate institutions wing of the family. So it's interesting that this wing of the family would be attacked in this fashion. Supposedly, the royal family is opening to the West, and they're sort of taking out the portion of the royal family that has been most friendly to the West. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So what does this mean for the country? I've seen a surprising number of people on Twitter, and not just people from Saudi Arabia, claiming that this is a good thing. I do not buy that. I've also seen a lot of people sort of recycling the Saudi government's explanation that this is about corruption. That's really hard to buy. These people are absolutely corrupt by any Western measure. But by the standards of Saudi Arabia, they are no more corrupt than anybody else playing the Saudi Game of Thrones. It's not that they're more corrupt, it's just that they lost the Game of Thrones. And the sort of definition of what corruption even means in a country where it's really, really hard to divide out who the royal family is, what the national budget is, what the oil budget is. All of this is mixed up together in Saudi Arabia in a way that is really impossible to even define from the Western mindset. So claiming that these folks are guilty of corruption is, I don't know, it's kind of ridiculous. It's very transparently, to me, just sort of spin. Sure, they were corrupt. Everybody in Saudi Arabia is corrupt in a very transparent way. And these folks have been arrested not because of acts of corruption, but because they fell out of favor. I think that this whole thing makes Saudi Arabia weaker, because what it does is it takes a system that was always anti-democratic and always deeply corrupt and messed up, but it was a system with these different factions in the royal family that could correct. You know, if one king was a mess, he could be replaced by another king with a different faction, and you could blame a certain faction for bad decisions that had been made, and you can move on to the other faction. So it provided a little bit of flexibility. Now we've got something that's very rigid, very top-down, and if something goes wrong at this point, it's very clear that it's King Salman and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, as we know him. I mean, the sort of adaptability of the regime, which was always poor by the standards of any real government, has now gotten dramatically worse. Now, I think that this move is almost certain to be popular internally. If you read a little bit about the just palatial compounds that were owned by some of these arrested billionaire princes, it's easy to get angry. And I think that people in Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabians, were definitely angry about this. And I think it's a very popular move for MBS to make here, to sort of single out particularly egregious rich dudes and arrest them and appropriate their stuff. I think that's a popular move. I think this will help MBS stay in power for another couple years or so. For sure, this is a good move. But the problem comes back to that rigidity, that lack of ability to adapt when you've just got one royal faction in power and you've got one guy who's to blame for everything that's been going on. It makes it a lot harder a year down the line, 2 years down the line, when something goes very, very wrong, to blame anybody else. So I think this is not just bad for Saudi Arabia, I think it's bad for the Saudi Arabian royal family. So then I suppose it could be good for Saudi Arabia eventually because it makes it less likely that the royal family will go on forever, but that's getting a little too complicated perhaps. It's also worth pointing out that MBS, despite the fact that he's pitched as a brand new leader like every week, has been in power for 3 years now, and despite the fact that he's able to pitch a good game and give a good interview to The Economist or The Guardian or what have you, he's made a lot of mistakes. He's actually pretty bad at governing Saudi Arabia. If you look at his foreign policy list, it's a mess. Yemen is a horror show. Syria is a horror show that was a complete failure. Lebanon, with the news from yesterday, is also a place where Saudi Arabia's influence has diminished almost completely. The Qatar crisis has been a mess. The Vision 2030 thing is definitely looking a lot harder to do now that they've arrested most of the they've arrested a bunch of foreign-facing billionaires. The Aramco IPO just got harder to do. I mean, there's such a tidal wave of failure behind this guy, and now there's really nobody else to blame. This is not good for the stability of Saudi Arabia, which should briefly bring us back to the really important thing that happened yesterday. The resignation of Lebanon's Prime Minister Hariri in Saudi Arabia is a sign that Lebanon could be destabilizing. Nothing is certain, but this destabilization of Lebanon makes a region-wide crisis much more likely. For some reason, MBS and Saudi Arabia seems to think that more region-wide crisis is a good thing for them, which I would argue has been demonstrated to not be the case over and over and over again over the past 6 years. But they're still for it. And if they succeed in partnering with Trump and bringing about another proxy war with Iran, I think that may actually be it for the Saudi royal family. If you want to know more about this issue and the region and why it would actually be a good thing to get rid of the Saudi royal family, I suggest you pick up my essay, Everybody's Lying About Islam, which is available now on the Amazon Kindle and in paperback form. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and you can pick up the essay at the link here. Thanks.